Kaiju number 8 has introduced us to a few powerful and equally interesting characters, but the one who grabs my attention the most is one of the heroines of the story, Kikuro Shinomiya, and as you've been watching the anime, you've caught glimpses of what it is that makes her such a fun and special character, but most importantly, you should have begun to see some of the many layers that exist beneath the surface of her character, which is why in today's newest Kaiju number 8 video here on Anime Explained, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the character of Shinomiya and explain why she is easily one of the best written characters in the series, possesses some of the most beautiful messages in the story, and hopefully make you walk away from this video with a greater appreciation for a character. As usual, this video will contain some spoilers if you're just starting out on the anime, but I'll try to keep it limited to only necessary information that's required to accomplish the goal of this video. In order to truly appreciate how her character is used to tell the very complex and beautiful messages of overcoming trauma, meeting expectations that come from familiar bonds that she shares with her parents, we have to first hop into our time machines and look back at her childhood. Her childhood and her journey towards becoming a Defense Force member are deeply intertwined with her family background, childhood experiences, and the pressures that she faced at a young age during her formative years. She is the daughter of two of the strongest members in history of the Defense Force. Her mother, Hikari Shinomiya, was a legendary figure and remembered for her efforts in the battle against Kaiju number 6, the strongest Kaiju in the series before Kafka arrived as Kaiju number 8, in a historic battle that saw her sacrifice herself during the fighting that consisted of multiple mass casualties. Her father is Isao Shinomiya, the director of the Defense Force, extremely powerful, extremely respected, and his stern demeanor and high expectations, they help influence Kikuro's upbringing. She was essentially born to be a Kaiju slayer because of who her parents were, possessing that high aptitude for the craft and quickly showing flashes of being a prodigy. It was a lot to carry on the tiny shoulders of someone so young, and yet she did just that because it was expected of her to walk into the footsteps of her parents, and so far she's done a remarkably good job in doing so. The loss of her mother was both used to give her the motivation to become a Kaiju slayer, but it was also used to set the foundation for her character and how she interacts with others because of the concept of trauma and how it affects people, to how they deal with the trauma and how they ultimately overcome the trauma. It's all at play here with her character. She possessed a well-deserved fear of Kaiju, which is to be expected. Kaiju in general, in particular the identified Kaiju, were the new apex predators of this world, but she also possessed a rightful hate for Kaiju, which became a high motivating factor for her to get stronger because despite her tendency at times to come across a bit like a tsundere, she truly cares deeply for others, in particular her comrades, and she wants to protect them so as to avoid similar tragedies from ever having to take place in the future. On the other hand, you could argue that the loss of her mother, who's sticking to the stereotypes and the traditional gender roles that you have in Japan, she would have been more nurturing towards her during her formative years. It led to a bit of an emotional distance and a strained relationship between her and her father, which only further added to her desire to train harder and improve in order to prove to herself that she was worthy, but also gain the sincere approval from her father, all while carrying around in the back of her mind her own inner demons that consist of inadequacy despite her being as skilled as she is. Such an upbringing and that raw talent. In a way, it caused her to have to rely upon herself even more. That strong independence and comfort with solidarity, it led to at times appearing as if she had trouble with connecting on a deeper level with others, likely due to the high standards that were set with her upbringing. From a very young age, she underwent intense combat training, learning multiple techniques in order to kill Kaiju and effectively fight back against them. The training was more than just physical. The extremely intense nature of the training itself was also a form of mental training because it required building a level of psychological fortitude that was required to face the horrors and the challenges that came from fighting against Kaiju. On top of that, she was expected to excel greatly in academics. Her education was very comprehensive, going over things such as strategy and tactics and scientific aspects of Kaiju. This becomes even more clear when we as a reader go back to the fact that due to her lineage, she was expected to be an amazing Kaiju Kaiju Slayer, and you can see how the intense but holistic approach to her character was taken because it was all meant to prepare her for the Defense Force. However, that did come with a bit of trade-offs. You could argue that unlike other children, her life it lacked the normal experiences that we tend to associate with children, in particular with their childhood. She didn't have the most time to play around and have social interactions. Instead, she was being locked in on a rigid training and studying. This in turn helped shape her in terms of the aspects of her personality that we see in her character, particularly early on in the story of the manga. All roads were leaning towards her joining the Defense Force because it was more than just a career choice. It was a continuation of the legacy of her character, and those tiny shoulders of hers, they were forced to carry that mountain-sized boulder for the entire time. Yet, what's interesting here is that her decision to join the Defense Force is both a byproduct of her personal desire to prove her own capabilities. Her actions in battle and interactions also allude to this being the case, and most importantly, it is a great message of what it means to be human and the human journey and human nature itself. Was she this good at being a Kaiju Slayer because of who her parents were, or was she as good because of her own talent and skill itself? That's where the beauty of this whole situation comes into play. Too often as people, we are very quick to say that someone is only as good at something as they are because of their genetics, which, don't get me wrong, genetics, they do play a role in a lot of things, but they aren't the make or break for you, and they don't mean anything if you yourself don't put in the work to take advantage of the genetics that you are blessed with. Yet at the same time, as she worked her way through the Defense Force, there was a natural shadow cast over her because of how big her name, her mother, was, and as you would expect, it makes it harder for you to carve out your own identity, which the story does just enough to make you realize this is an internal conflict for a character without making you get beat over the head with it like it was a Cherokee drum being pounded. It was her own hard work and her desire to protect the ones who she would call comrades that ultimately made the praise she earned as a standout candidate during the recruitment process so much worth it. While at times you could see that there were issues with teamwork and connecting to build relationships among her peers, that didn't change the fact that hidden deep beneath the surface was someone who still cared very greatly for her comrades, even if they themselves couldn't see it due to her demeanor. It's when she meets Kafka, someone who she would have been right to think was rather unremarkable, not even average at best, that we see a light begin to shine on her character. The prodigy was now being put in a position by someone well below average, where her perceptions and her attitude, they were at times being indirectly and directly challenged. Yet as we see over the course of the story, Kafka earned her respect and was teaching her through his actions and at times his inactions that there are different types of strengths that need to be valued. As you read and watch Kaiju number 8, I'd make the strong argument that Kafka played a pretty vital role in her growth of her character, which is exactly what you want from your series protagonist. After all, we see it when we chart out her character growth from the beginning of the story to where she is currently. She understands much better now the value of individual prowess and the ability to inspire and support others. Even though she was using the same numbers weapon that once belonged to her mother, we see as she begins to start pushing through her limits physically and emotionally that it's both possible to honor her mother's memory while also forging her own path as a unique and formidable fighter. In this regard, the concept of maintaining familiar bonds while also breaking away from them enough to walk your own separate path, while it is executed in a different manner, it is very similar to the intention behind the Naruto character known as Boruto Uzumaki, but in this case I'd argue that Shinomiya was handled in a much better approach. But a lot of that payoff comes from her battle with Kaiju number 15 later in the story. The battle with Kaiju number 15 was so important because it was the culmination of so much of her character up to this point in the story that it allowed her to slay the biggest figurative dragon for her story, which is the long-reaching shadow that the ghost of her mother ultimately casted. Think about it for a second. How many times have we seen characters directly compare her to her mother? Even the numbers weapon that she uses once belonged to her mother. Carving out one's own identity and proving that you're more than just your genetics, it isn't an easy thing to do when you've got those things working against you. It'd be all too easy to have fears and insecurities that you won't be able to achieve greatness on your own, and that what greatness you do create, people would just attribute it to, well, look at who her family is, look at who her mother is. Yet what I love about this is that while it is an internal conflict for her, her character has a tendency, a tenacity, and a drive to power through those things, which this is handled beautifully in how the memories of Kaiju number 4 allow her to see the ghost of her mother. It is placing her internal conflict right there with an external force. Not only does she have people making the comparisons to her mother in real life, but even the kaiju numbers weapon that she uses also has the memories of her mother that allows her to see her mother's ghost. This is what ultimately makes that battle with kaiju number 15 both so heartbreaking but also so rewarding, because it accomplishes everything that it needs to in order to properly cement her character for readers. The complex relationship that she has with her father, where she pushes herself to seek out approval and validation from her father, and constantly seeing the ghost of her mother when she uses her numbers weapon, and all of those insecurities, they are primed for being exploited in the intense battle with kaiju number 15. And what I love about these fights is that it showcases one of the other laws from the 48 laws of power, which can be applied to combat, which is law number 33, discover each man's thumbscrew. In battles with some enemies in particular, the fights, they are won or lost oftentimes before the first shot's ever fired, before the first punch is ever thrown, or whatever physical method that you use depending on the series itself. With some enemies, if they can get inside of your mind, then they win the fight, or they come dangerously close to winning the fight, where they don't have to do much else in terms of the moves they need to make before they can say checkmate. Kaiju number 15 uses that method, and in particular uses law number 33, which makes it a point to drive home every man has a thumbscrew, a weakness, a gap in their castle. Most likely that is an insecurity, an uncontrollable emotion, or a need. Once you find that thumbscrew, you continuously turn it in order to bend your enemy to your will via psychological warfare to take apart their armor and leave themselves vulnerable and begging for mercy. In particular, the law lays out a lot of the times these thumbscrews, they are rooted in something regarding a target's childhood. It's one of the first places you look when trying to pinpoint a weakness to shatter, and kaiju number 15, they were no exception to this cruel method of fighting in the battle with Shinomiya. The weakness for her was her insecurity. Her uncontrollable emotion was her fear and her inadequacy and her fear of failure, and her need is something that stemmed from her childhood when it came from wanting the approval of her father, which had carried on all the way up until this point in the story. Kaiju number 15 found that weak spot and exploited it. The mental warfare that this battle gave us, it was enough that it would have broken the most self-assured person. But as the expression goes, pressure makes diamonds, and for a prodigy like her, the pressure that this fight applied made her into the hardest of the diamond. This battle was a critical pivot moment for both the series as well as for Shinomiya's character arc and her overarching arc and narrative. It's the small things like the very appearance of kaiju number 15 which makes the mind game so very clear. That much is obvious in terms of the effect when you see kaiju number 15 side by side with Shinomiya herself. The battle, it is ripe with exploitation of her memories, her emotions, and her insecurities, as well as the attack on her soul by targeting her subconscious. Kaiju number 15 questioned why was it that she wanted to become stronger, and used the info that she got to further attack her in the form of cruel taunts and gaslighting, all in the hopes of pushing her to despair and shattering her soul. Yet it was because she ultimately overcame all of this and had her weaknesses exposed in such a raw way that Shinomiya came out of this situation not only the victor but also for the better, and those invisible wounds beneath the surface known as emotional damage and trauma, they had now been healed, and her character was able to mature more as a result of this fight. And most importantly, it allowed for such a well-written character to be given a very proper cementation into the foundation of this very rich story that we all know and love, known as Kaiju number 8. While she isn't the strongest character, she is my favorite character of the series, and I hope you leave this video with a greater appreciation. And if you're still curious about the world of Kaiju number 8, make sure to click this playlist on the right for more Kaiju number 8 videos, or make sure to click this anime explained video that you see on the other side of the screen.